I used to love winter. The crisp air, the way the snow made everything seem peaceful. But now, I dread it. Because every time I see fresh snowfall, I remember that night. It happened 3 years ago. I was staying at my uncle's cabin in northern Minnesota. It was remote, no neighbors for miles, just an old logging road leading up to it. I had gone up there alone for a weekend getaway, hoping for some peace and quiet. The first day was fine. I spent most of it reading by the fire, watching the snow pile up outside. By nightfall, the storm had turned brutal. Thick flakes whipping against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. I was about to go to bed when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow outside. At first, I thought they were mine from earlier, but then I realized something chilling. The tracks led to the cabin, but there were no tracks leading away. I stared out into the dark forest beyond the porch, my breath fogging up the window. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just missed the return footprints somehow, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. Then came the sound. A light, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window to my left, the one right by the couch. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see a branch or some loose shutter knocking in the wind. Instead, I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the glass, staring in at me. His face was pale, almost grey in the dim light. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His lips were cracked and dark, and his hair hung in wet clumps over his forehead. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a thin, tattered hoodie and jeans, despite the freezing temperatures. I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. He shouldn't have been there. No one should have been out in that storm. And yet, there he was. Then he grinned. It was slow, unnatural, like he had to force his muscles to move. His teeth were jagged and stained, and his breath fogged up the glass as he let out a low, wheezing chuckle. I scrambled away from the window, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But of course, no signal. The storm had knocked it out. The tapping started again. Harder this time, more insistent. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it so tight my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to peek back at the window. He was gone. I scanned the porch, the tree line, the driveway. Nothing, just swirling snow and darkness. Then came a noise from the back of the cabin, a slow, deliberate creak, like a door being pushed open. I nearly dropped the poker. I knew I had locked the door. I was certain of it. But in my panic, doubt started creeping in. Had I really locked it? I had to check. I crept down the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the back porch was slightly ajar, snow blowing in across the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat. I pushed the door shut and locked it, deadbolt and all. That's when I heard it. A raspy, whispering breath coming from under the bed. I ran. I didn't even look. I just ran straight out the front door, into the freezing snow, my boots sinking with every frantic step. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking. I got in, locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. And there he was, standing at the tree line, watching, still grinning. I didn't wait. I threw the car into reverse and tore down that icy road, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I didn't sleep that night. When I finally returned to the cabin the next morning with the sheriff, there were no signs of forced entry, just a single set of footprints leading from the woods to my window, but no prints leading away. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota. the kind of place where winter feels like it lasts half the year. The snow comes early, the temperatures drop fast, and by December, you're lucky if your car even starts in the morning. This happened about 3 years ago, during the coldest winter I can remember. It was late January, and we were in the middle of a brutal cold snap. Temperatures well below zero, wind chill even worse. My parents had gone on a short trip to visit my uncle, leaving me home alone for the weekend. I was 19, old enough to handle myself, but still. Winter nights in an empty house can feel a little eerie. The first night was uneventful. I bundled up, watched TV, and listened to the wind howl outside. The house creaked more than usual, but I chalked it up the cold. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. Around 11 p.m., I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was knocking. Not at the front door, but somewhere on the side of the house. A slow, deliberate tapping against the wall. I froze. No one should be out in this kind of weather. Anyone walking around at this hour in these temperatures would be either insane or in serious trouble. Cautiously, I walked to the window, careful not to be seen. The porch light was on, casting a weak glow across the frozen yard. Snowdrifts piled up against the trees, and the wind sent flurries swirling through the air. But there, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. A figure. At first I thought it was a man, but something about it was wrong. It stood too still, too stiff, its head tilted slightly like it was listening. Its skin, if that's what it was, looked pale, almost bluish, like frostbite had set in deep. It wasn't wearing a coat, just tattered clothing that hung stiff with ice. And then I noticed the worst part. Its eyes were open, but they weren't looking at anything. They were frozen over, white and glassy, like a corpse pulled from a lake. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts, fogging up the glass. The knocking started again, this time on a different wall. It was moving around the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but as soon as I hit call, the line went dead. No service. That wasn't unusual in bad weather, but at that moment, it felt like the worst possible luck. The knocking came again, now at the back door, louder this time, more urgent. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I wasn't about to just stand there. Then, something happened that made my stomach drop. I heard the back door latch click. The door was locked, I was sure of it. But the sound was unmistakable, like something was testing the handle, trying to get in. I ran to the door, pressing my back against it, holding it shut even though I knew the lock should be enough. I could hear it breathing on the other side, a ragged, frozen sound like air being sucked through ice. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed there for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe. The wind howled outside, but the knocking didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off against the door. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how silent everything was. The storm had died down, leaving only an eerie stillness outside. I hesitated, then finally worked up the nerve to check the porch. There were no footprints in the snow, nothing. Just smooth, untouched drifts stretching across the yard. But there, on the glass of the back door, was a handprint, not a normal one. The fingers were too long, the shape slightly warped, as if the flesh had been frozen and twisted. And even though the house was warm, even though hours had passed, the ice still hadn't melted. I never told my parents. What would I even say? But I don't stay home alone in the winter anymore. Not after that night. Because whatever was outside my house that night, it wasn't human. I've always loved winter. There's something about the way fresh snow muffles sound, how the world feels softer, quieter, peaceful. At least, that's how I used to feel before the night I saw him. It happened last December, during a particularly brutal snowstorm. I was driving home from my parents' house after an early holiday dinner, taking the long way through the back roads to avoid the highway traffic. The snow was coming down in thick, swirling flakes, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My car tires crunched over the icy road, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the windows. I was about 15 minutes from home when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Just ahead, on the side of the road, stood a man. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a pair of dark pants and a pale, long-sleeved shirt that clung to his thin frame. His skin was sickly white, almost blending into the snow around him. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating his face. His expression was blank, his eyes dark and hollow. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't moving at all. He just stood there, staring at me. Something about him made my stomach tighten with unease. I didn't stop. I told myself that maybe he was some drunk who wandered too far from a party. Or maybe his car broke down and he was waiting for help. But the logical part of my brain knew better. No one should have been out there dressed like that, in temperatures well below freezing. As I passed, my headlights swept over him, and for a split second, I swear I saw his lips move. He didn't speak, but it was as if he was forming silent words. I kept driving. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. I blinked, my pulse spiking. There was nowhere for him to have gone. The road was surrounded by open fields of untouched snow, no trees, no ditches deep enough to hide in. And yet, he was no longer there. The rest of the drive home was a blur of creeping dread. I locked my doors the second I pulled into my driveway and rushed inside, my breath fogging up in the cold night air. But the unease didn't fade. Even as I got into bed, the image of that man's face was burned into my mind. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. My room was silent, save for the faint howling of the wind outside, but something felt off. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. The footsteps continued, moving closer, just outside my bedroom window. I didn't want to look. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Peeking through the curtain, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing in my snow-covered yard, was the man. The same blank face, the same dark eyes staring straight at my window. But there was something different now. He was smiling. A slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening with pure terror. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but as soon as I looked back outside, he was gone. The police arrived 20 minutes later, their flashlights sweeping over my yard. They found footprints in the snow leading up to my window. But the strangest part, there were no footprints leading away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, fresh snowfall had covered any remaining tracks. The police assured me it was probably just some prankster trying to scare me, but I could tell they didn't believe it either. That was almost a year ago. I moved out of that house in the spring. But even now, I still feel uneasy whenever it snows, because sometimes when I look outside at night, I swear I still see him, standing there, waiting.